I've learned that the most dangerous crimes aren't always driven by impulse. They're driven by belief. Because when violence is wrapped in ideology, it doesn't feel like violence to the people committing it. It feels like purpose. This is one of those cases. In the 1990s, South Australia became the setting for what would later be known as the Snowtown Murders, sometimes called the Bodies in Barrels case. It remains Australia's most prolific serial killing operation, not because one man killed alone, but because one man convinced others that killing was justified. At the center of it all was John Justin Bunting. Bunting didn't see himself as a murderer. He didn't believe he was doing harm. He saw himself as a protector, a self-appointed guardian of morality in a world he believed was rotten beyond repair. In his mind, society had failed. Authorities were weak. Justice was broken. And someone had to step in. So he decided that someone was him. That belief mattered more than any single crime, because once Bunting accepted that role, everything else became easier to justify. If he was protecting others, then cruelty wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. If he was preventing future harm, then the people he targeted weren't victims. They were threats. That kind of thinking is powerful. It turns suspicion into certainty, rumors into convictions, and personal hatred into moral duty. Bunting didn't need proof. He didn't want it. Proof would have complicated things. Proof would have required restraint. Belief required none of that. And once he convinced himself he was on the right side of history, he no longer felt bound by the rules everyone else lived under. That's when the line disappeared. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But quietly. And once that line was gone, there was nothing left to stop him from pulling others across it with him. Bunting's worldview was built on resentment. Resentment toward authority, toward institutions, toward people who lived differently than he did. He spoke often about justice, about keeping children safe, about removing what he called undesirables from society. But there was no evidence behind his accusations, only suspicion, and suspicion repeated often enough became certainty. Bunting was persuasive, not loud, not charismatic in a traditional sense, but confident. He spoke with certainty, with moral conviction, and people confuse conviction with truth more often than they realize. He gathered people around him who were already vulnerable, people who wanted belonging, approval, direction, and he gave them something simple: an enemy. Robert Joe Wagner became Bunting's closest follower. Quiet, obedient, willing, Wagner didn't question Bunting's authority. He absorbed it. James Flyer Dan Vlasakis was younger. He didn't join as a killer. He joined as a dependent. Bunting became a father figure, a source of approval, a voice that defined right and wrong. And once that bond was in place, leaving became psychologically difficult. Mark Ray Hayden occupied a different role. He didn't lead. He didn't preach ideology or draw up lists of enemies. He assisted. And that distinction matters, because Hayden represents a kind of involvement that's harder to understand, and in some ways, harder to confront. He wasn't the voice in the room telling others what to believe. He was the one who went along, the one who didn't stop it, the one who helped when help should have been unthinkable, including helping dispose of bodies, even when those bodies belonged to his own wife and his own nephew. That fact alone tells you how deep the manipulation went. But it also tells you something about slow moral collapse. Hayden didn't wake up one day willing to erase his own family. There's no evidence of that kind of sudden cruelty. What happened instead was gradual. A steady narrowing of choices. A long stretch of silence where objection became harder than compliance. When you live inside an environment where one person controls the narrative, where fear and loyalty are constantly reinforced, resistance doesn't feel brave. It feels dangerous. So you start making smaller compromises. You stay quiet. You help with one thing, then another. You convince yourself you're already too involved to turn back. And over time, the unthinkable becomes routine. That's what Hayden's role exposes. Not a mastermind. Not a leader. But a reminder that participation doesn't always come from belief. Sometimes it comes from fear, from dependency, from the slow erosion of a person's ability to say no. And once that erosion is complete, even the most fundamental bonds, family, love, responsibility, can be overridden by the need to survive what you've already become part of. That's not an excuse. But it is a warning. Because cases like this aren't just about the people who lead others into darkness. They're also about the people who follow, long after they know they shouldn't. One of the most chilling elements of this case was something Bunting kept in his spare room. A wall, later referred to as the spider wall. On that wall were names, not photographs, not evidence, just names, connected by string. A crude web that turned human beings into concepts, and concepts into justifications. Each name represented a person John Bunting believed was dangerous or immoral, not because of proven crimes, not because of verified harm, but because of what he believed they were. Predators, homosexuals, disabled individuals, transgender people, anyone he decided was weak, different, or unwanted. The categories shifted depending on his mood, his grudges, and his need for control. Some names came from rumors passed through social circles, whispers repeated until they sounded like facts, accusations with no source, no verification, no chance for response. Some names came from personal grudges, arguments, resentments, people who had crossed him, challenged him, or simply irritated him. And some names came from nothing at all, just suspicion, just dislike, just the quiet decision that someone didn't belong. But once a name was placed there, it stopped being a person. It became a target. That's how violence becomes possible. You remove complexity, you remove humanity, you replace individuals with labels that feel easier to destroy. The wall didn't just organize names, it organized permission. Permission to stop asking questions. Permission to stop doubting. Permission to believe that what came next wasn't cruelty, but necessity. And once a system like that is built, it doesn't need constant reinforcement. The wall did the work. Every string told a story. Every connection reinforced belief. And every name reminded the people in that room that judgment had already been passed. Not by law, not by evidence, but by someone who decided that belief was enough. And when belief replaces truth, the distance between accusation and violence disappears. This is how ideology becomes lethal. It simplifies people into labels. And once someone is a label, hurting them doesn't feel personal anymore. Between 1992 and 1999, the group murdered at least 11 people. The violence was not spontaneous. It was ritualized, planned, repeated. The methods were designed not just to kill, but to dominate, to break people down, to reinforce control within the group. Because cruelty doesn't just harm victims, it binds perpetrators together. The group also engaged in identity theft. They stole welfare benefits using the names of the dead. They recorded victims' voices to convince families their loved ones were still alive, and had simply moved away. That deception bought time. Time for more violence. Time for belief to harden into routine. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. And structure makes violence sustainable. The case began to unravel in 1999 with the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden. Up until that point, people had vanished quietly. Lives had ended without immediate alarm, and suspicion had struggled to find a single place to land. But Elizabeth's absence felt different. She didn't simply drift away. She didn't leave behind a story that could be explained with distance or time. People noticed she was gone. Questions were asked sooner. Concerns weren't brushed aside as easily, and for the first time those questions didn't fade. As police began looking into Elizabeth's disappearance, they followed threads that earlier cases never fully pulled. Conversations that once sounded harmless suddenly felt uneasy. Names that had come up before were mentioned again. Connections that had seemed incidental started to form a shape, and slowly the investigation narrowed. That trail led investigators to an unlikely place. An abandoned bank building in the small town of Snowtown. A quiet place. Unassuming. The kind of location people passed without giving a second thought. It wasn't marked by noise or activity. It was marked by neglect. Inside the building was a vault. A space designed to protect valuables. To lock things away. To keep what's inside hidden and untouched. And when police opened that vault, they realized they weren't dealing with a single crime. They were standing at the end point of something much larger. What they found there didn't just answer questions. It rewrote the entire case. Because the Snowtown discovery wasn't about one disappearance. It was proof that people hadn't simply gone missing. They had been taken, and whatever was happening hadn't been accidental, impulsive, or isolated. It had been organized, planned, and waiting to be found. That moment changed everything. For investigators, for the public, and for a country that suddenly had to confront the reality that something far darker had been growing quietly, right out of sight. Inside the bank vault, officers found plastic barrels. Inside those barrels were human remains. 8 people, preserved, hidden, stored like objects. Further searches uncovered additional bodies. 2 buried in the backyard of Bunting's former home in Salisbury North. 1 in a shallow grave at Lower Light. The scale of the crimes became undeniable. The discovery shocked the country. But investigators quickly realized something worse. This wasn't a single crime scene. It was the endpoint of a long process. The trial that followed was the longest and most expensive in South Australian history. What unfolded in court wasn't just evidence of murder. It was a lesson in manipulation. James Vlasakis testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed how Bunting controlled the group, how dissent was discouraged, how doubt was framed as weakness, how violence became normalized. Bunting ruled through ideology and fear. He didn't need constant force. He needed belief, and belief did the rest. The sentences reflected the severity of the crimes. John Bunting was convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without parole. Robert Wagner received 10 life sentences without parole. James Vlasakis received life with a non-parole period. Mark Hayden served 25 years and was released decades later. But sentences don't explain how this happened. They don't explain how ordinary people crossed moral lines they can't uncross. The Snowtown murders are often discussed in terms of brutality, and the brutality is real. It can't be minimized. It shouldn't be looked away from. But focusing only on how violent the crimes were misses the deeper story. Because what truly powered this case wasn't rage or chaos. It was ideology. It was the belief that some people had more value than others, that some lives were worth protecting, and others were expendable, that judgment could replace law, and certainty could replace doubt. That kind of thinking is dangerous precisely because it feels clean. Moral certainty offers comfort. It removes ambiguity. It tells people they don't have to wrestle with complexity. Once someone believes they are on the right side of morality, cruelty stops feeling cruel. It starts to feel justified. Labeling people as less than is how that shift happens. You reduce a person to a category, a rumor, a suspicion. You stop seeing a human being with a history, relationships, and contradictions. Instead, you see a label that feels easier to erase. And once that label sticks, harm no longer feels like harm. It feels like correction, like prevention, like duty. That's the most unsettling part of this case. The violence wasn't random. It was organized around belief. And belief has a way of spreading, especially when it promises order in a world that feels chaotic. The Snowtown murders remind us that extreme violence doesn't always begin with hate. It often begins with certainty, with the idea that there's no need to question, no need to verify, no need to listen. And when questioning stops, cruelty finds room to grow. That's why this case matters beyond its own time and place. Because the danger it exposes isn't rare. It's human. And it doesn't disappear just because we tell ourselves we'd never do the same. It disappears only when certainty is challenged, before belief turns into permission. This case forces an uncomfortable realization, that the most dangerous beliefs aren't always extreme at first. They start small, with suspicion, with grievance, with the idea that some people don't belong. And once that idea takes hold, everything else becomes easier to justify. I'm Detective Pennyworth, and this is one of those cases that reminds you, evil doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like certainty. And when people stop questioning their certainty, that's when the damage becomes unstoppable. If you want to stay with these stories and the truths behind them, you could subscribe to the channel. We'll keep telling the cases that don't offer comfort, but still demand understanding.